Hello, welcome to Odor's Always Moves, where we're translating the complexity of odor movement down to the operational level for canine handlers and trainers. This is the 9th video in the series, and we're going to be talking about urban terrain. Specifically, we're going to look at what's something called the Venturi effect, and then also how the terrain, the buildings, everything create eddies, and how that influences our odor movement. As always, these videos are dedicated to my first bomb dog, Daisy. And these are just for educational purposes. So if you want something more intense, reach out to myself or others in the professional field. But for now, this is just to give you a general understanding of fluid dynamics and how it influences odor movement and availability for your dog. Now, with urban terrain, the biggest thing is the impact of buildings. And why? Because there's a lot of buildings in an urban environment. And all those buildings and the narrow streets and stuff, there's several things that come into play. One is the channelization of flows, and that's going to cause the Venturi effect. And then it creates a variable wind speeds throughout the entire environment. So you'll have high velocity zones and low and zero velocity zones, and in very short distances. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. And then because of that and the shapes of the buildings and the variable wind speeds, you get a lot of strong and numerous eddies throughout the environment, again, over very short distances. And then the varying surfaces, barriers, you can have vegetation, rows of trees, that kind of things, bushes, all those things will start influencing how that odor is moving, and when you get down onto the micro level of your operation. Now, with urban terrain, shapes matter. And you can see on the right, I got two shapes. I got a cylinder and I got a cube. And you can see the flows going around it. And you can see the eddies on the downwind sides. And on the curved shape, those eddies are pretty minimal and they're not that significant. Whereas on the cube shape, those eddies, and we've seen this before, are more pronounced, a little bit faster. And that's just simply because the air has to work harder to get around that. And then once it gets on the backside, it there's no smooth pathway around. And so it basically creates these areas of high turbulence. And we've talked about that before, how the higher velocity flows around the sides, pulls the air that's close to the backside in, and it creates a circular motion. Okay. But the biggest thing to understand is that those sharp angles create more turbulence, and that's going to decrease your odor concentration on the backside of buildings. And it's going to move it around a lot, and it's going to make things a little complicated for your dog. Now, this is the same shapes, except this is an actual CFD model, and this just shows you the differences in the turbulence between them. Okay, here on the downside of the curve shape, yeah, there's turbulence. I mean, there's eddies on this downside, but it's somewhat localized and it's not that dramatic. And you could see these particle flows are nice and laminar in many regards. And it starts getting some turbulence down here, and actually, what you'll see on the backside of the curves is that turbulence zone will vary um, as it goes. But look on the downside of the cube. One, you see these real high velocities, really sharp angles, and the result is these very large extended areas of turbulence downwind, and that's what I'm talking about. The building, these areas of turbulence on the back downwind side of it can be extensive, and the higher the wind velocity, the more extensive and the more turbulent they're going to be. So just something to kind of keep in mind. Now, the Venturi effect. And this is just a principle where the pressure drops and the velocity increases as the fluids pass through a constricted opening. Okay. So if I have a pipe here, this is just a cross section of pipe, and say these are the pipe walls, and I have a flow going through it, and it's just moving right along, nice and steady, nothing fancy. Okay. Unrestricted flow. That's what we're talking about. But now I have the same pipe, but I have a constriction right here. Okay, so I have the pipe diameter here, and then that pipe diameter reduces. Okay, What's going to happen is that flow is going to come along, and in order to go through it, it's got to speed up. Okay, the pressure drops, we don't worry about that, but the velocity increases dramatically. Then it slows back down to its normal pace. That's going to be a factor in an urban terrain because we have these narrow streets that, constrict the flow and will increase the velocity. Now let's take a look at that. And we're going to look at two different scenarios. One's parallel wind flows, where basically the streets and the buildings are at 90 degrees, in relation to the wind. And so I have a scenario here, and I have three odor sources. So you're going to have to mentally kind of keep track of this. So this source up here, and these are all the exact same odor amount. They're basically simulating the odor from a person. So if you guys are trackers, urban terrain or law enforcement who are, dual purpose tracking and apprehension, applies to you. But the principles apply to anything in the detection world. Okay. But this odor up here, the blue one, so any of the blue odor is going to be coming from this source. He's on the upwind side. There is no obstruction upwind of him. Okay. And then here, this is going to be the interesting one that I'm really going to want you guys to watch, is this red one. This is up on the roof. It's about 12 feet up, so about 3 meters. And it's above street level. He's on top of the building. He's on a roof. Okay. And then this third one, the yellow one, that he's downwind. He's not only downwind of this structure here, but he's also downwind of this large building here. And that's going to all influence things. And then I just put in some canine teams, and we're going to look at a ground perspective from one of them just to give you an idea. And I have ground views of others, but for this video, we're just going to look at this one here. And just like in our past scenarios that we've done in other videos, I'm going to use a variable wind. So the first third of the video is going to be 1 mile per hour velocity. The second third of the video is 5 miles per hour velocity. And then the last third is 10 miles per hour velocity. So let's just start this. This is 1 mile per hour. You can see the odor plumes moving. And this is, it makes sense. 1 mile per hour, nothing too dramatic. And we're going to look at the dog zone in a bit, and that'll help clarify some things. But you can see that odor in the low wind speeds, it reaches out there quite a bit. But now we're switching up to 5 miles per hour, and you're going to start seeing the shift in terms of the turbulence. And then also the odor plumes start constricting and start getting more or less concentrated downwind. And then that's only going to be amplified when we switch to the 10 mile per hour wind speeds, which it just did. And if you notice though, this area down here, that blue reached all the way down here at the 1 mile per hour, but it's not coming down there at all now. Okay, so it's staying well up by the source. Whereas this one down here is reaching clear downwind. But if you notice, it's actually above the street. This is actually well above the street. Dog wouldn't detect it at all. Same with this one, very high level, and it's staying above ground level. Okay. Now let's take a look at the dog zone. Okay, we're only going to be seeing the odor that's from the surface up to about a meter. So as expected, not seeing much of the red, but all of a sudden there's a red pocket there. There's another red pocket there. This one's moving down. This one's out here. These are all making sense in terms of, but if you notice this, again, that odor source is 12 feet above the ground, and he's creating large plumes, but these plumes are not staying stable. They're mixing up. And as we switch to the 5 miles per hour, you notice this odor plume reached down, but now it starts constricting back. And these reds keep popping up, but they disappear. They pop up, but they disappear. And this now 10 miles per hour, kind of the same thing. Not much downwind for the dog. Not much downwind for the dog. And then all of a sudden, boom, I have this pocket of red, and then it disappears again. Okay. And this makes things a little complicated. And again, this is now at the 10 mile per hour range. But just because you're downwind doesn't necessarily mean your dog's going to be in detectable odor. And that's because of the terrain. So let's take a look at this from a different perspective. This is just a particle streamer, so this is just looking at the pathway. This is the low velocity. This is the 1 mile per hour. You can see some turbulence down on the backside of this building. Turbulence on the backside of this building. This is what we were talking about. And some decent turbulence down on this one. Okay. But if you notice this flow, it comes around and it's channelizing, just like we talked about earlier, channelizing down this street here. Okay, and it's kind of an unobstructed flow until it gets to these trees, and then you start seeing some variation in it. But notice that there's not a lot of activity down in here. Okay, we're gonna look at that a little bit deeper in a couple slides. And this is the 5 mile per hour, and you can start seeing that the color is getting a little bit brighter down here than some of the other areas. And so as the wind speeds pick up, it starts influencing, going in this channel, how much odor is able to stay concentrated. And what's occurring, we've talked about this before, is that shear dispersion and turbulence diffusion. As that velocity increases, the odor concentration is going to go down. Okay, the odor just can't maintain concentration in high velocity flows. And the biggest thing I want us to look at, so we see the turbulence here, these eddies on these downwind sides. Everything's normal there. We're seeing a channelizing effect here, but down between these two buildings and down here, you notice that these flows are going right over. They're nice and steady right over the top of the buildings with very little activity down low. And if we look at the higher velocity, kind of the same thing. Not much changes, but this velocity here definitely changed. That's reaching the high end of our scale. Okay, so our normal velocity, our flow in this model is at 4 meters per second. Okay, and like this color right here, that's normal. That's your normal velocity. But all of a sudden, we are now at the 5 meters per second. So this is substantially accelerated here and here, and then also down here. But this is the one I'm more concerned about because I got a canine team here and I got a source of odor up here. So that's a really high velocity relative to the rest, some of the other parts of the model. So two things. This area here, I got high velocity. And then I have very little flow down here in this area. So I'm just not seeing that turbulence. So we're going to look at this area a little bit more in a bit, but let's talk about this one. And this is just a slice. This is about 1.5 meters, 2 meters off the ground. I think it's a meter. And you can see how much faster that velocity is. And so as we've shown in other videos, the higher the velocity of the airflow, the lower concentration of the odor that's going to be available for the dog. And that is why you saw the odor have those nice blue, that nice big odor plume from the blue odor reaching all the way down here. But as soon as that wind started picking up, this area in here became faster and it's not able to maintain that concentration levels. Okay, so the dog may actually pick it up, but maybe it's such a small level, or it's if it does pick up a concentration that it can detect, it'll be fleeting. And so it's something to kind of keep in mind as you're working in those high wind conditions. So, but this is literally is the Venturi effect right here. You have this constrained flow area, and the wind, the fluid, has to accelerate to get through it. And that's all that's happening. And because of that acceleration, the odor concentration reduces. Now let's take a look at this area down here where we were seeing those pockets of red and and they kind of pop up and then disappear, pop up and then disappear. If I looked at if I took a slice like right down this plane here, and you can see all these nice red arrows are nice and straight. They're our normal velocity. This is what we call our laminar flow, and all that means is the velocities between layers is consistent. So there's no real turbulence and interaction. This is nice, steady flow. This is what fluids like. That's what I mean. They take the path of least resistance. They're lazy. They want this laminar flow, and they will always revert to this and try to take that path that establishes this. But you get down here, well, it starts getting a little more jumbled because you got these objects, you got the trees, and that starts influencing it. And this is just another picture of that. I have this beautiful red. This is our consistent velocities. And as we start getting down towards the buildings, where we start having turbulence, this laminar flow starts breaking down. And you can just see this dividing zone here. This area below it is our turbulence down here. And this is a little bit more turbulent. So I have low velocity, high velocity. And we saw that. We saw that curving and all that kind of rat's nest area behind the building. But this is the one that's interesting. It's not much going on down here. It's kind of there's turbulence. We saw the particle streamers. There's a little bit of motion in there, but not much. Same with back on this side. So what's going on? Well, as we look at this, we got our flows. It comes up, and we've seen this graphic before. Comes up over the object, goes over the top, creates a turbulence zone, and then that eddy on that backside. Okay, it's high velocity. But because fluids want to get into that laminar flow, they're lazy. They're going to come over, and if those objects are too close together, it's going to say, I'm not going to waste my energy and go down in here. I'm going to go right over the top, and then when I have a landing zone and I have no more obstructions, I'm going to drop down. And that's why you see that stronger eddy on this backside, but you have very minimal movement down in this zone here. And that's what's occurring is it's a very low velocity relative to the overall flow. And so odor does get pulled down into it, and it's able to concentrate because it's low velocity, but it's still turbulent. It's still moving around. So that's why it doesn't stick around. It's not like a nice steady pool. It's getting moved around, so it does get diffused. And so you'll see these pockets. But when you start having buildings close together, or any objects really, and you can see it in vegetation and so forth, that laminar flow will always want to go up over the top. And there'll be some turbulence down here, but it'll be low velocity. Okay, and so kind of keep that in mind with regards to if you're tracking or doing some detection work in between buildings and stuff. Um, that can cause the odor to do some weird things that may be hard to visualize in your mind when you're running it. So let's take a look at the ground level. So this is that red odor up here, and here's my canine team. And we're just going to run it. You know that there's 3 different velocities, and let's just kind of see how that red odor looks like. And remember, he's up here on top of this building. You can see it running out, drops down to the ground a little bit, then it's up again, and you can see it drop down a little bit. It's up again, almost inundated with odor, but then it gets back up again. And you can see that there's a lot of variation in where the odor is in terms of where the dog can detect it. And it's kind of all over the place. And keep in mind, this is sped up. This is, so it'd be a little bit slower in the real world. But it is important to understand that the influences of the terrain and the trees and, just because my dog's getting into odor, it's acting in odor, I have to be mindful of what's the wind doing, and could the source be in a place I'm not expecting? Okay, so and then that's going to come down to reading your dog and just being aware of your surroundings and your terrain. Okay, but hopefully that gives you an idea of how complex an urban setting can be in a windy environment. I mean that odor was dropping down, then it was gone, dropping down, then it was gone. So it's not an easy situation, and nobody give me any grief because I have a tree that's outside of my landscaping, and I screwed that up. So yes, I have a tree that's in the middle of my street. So yeah, didn't affect the model. These are, and just so you guys know, these trees are mimicking vegetation. They're a porous zone, so they are actually acting like real trees in the model space. They're not just there for looks. So let's take a look at angled wind flows. And this is where we are going to be, the buildings are rotated. So here's our environment. Basically it's the same model, but I added some buildings just to give it some more depth. And if you notice, it's angled now. Okay, it's rotated 45 degrees. And our odor sources are the same. So this is the one that's upwind of that building. This is my odor source up on top of the building, and this is the one down in same colors. So there's no confusion there. And I still got my canine teams. We're not going to do any ground views of those. I have that information, but may save that for later on down the road. And the wind's going to be the exact same: 1 mile per hour for the first third, 5 miles per hour for the second third, and then 10 miles per hour for the last. So as we start running, we're just watching the odor plumes, the total odor plumes. We'll do the dog zone next. And you can see the 1 mile per hour, everything's really making sense. Nothing too dramatic. And, you know, where things are start getting weird, though, is right here. If you notice that odor went backwards. It went into the wind. And it's sticking on the backside of this building. Now we're at the 5 miles per hour, and you can see the odor concentration is reduced dramatically, but this odor is literally going against the wind. Look at that. The wind. Keep in mind what direction the wind is, and look at how the odor is moving. Okay, the red, the blue, and the yellow are doing what makes sense. The red's really complicated, and it's literally going against the wind, at least the regional wind. Okay, and this is what we're going to see here in a little bit. Okay, let this finish out. Okay. So hopefully this, you have an idea of what's going on. We've already given you the tools, so hopefully you can have a grasp of what's happening here. Let's look at the dog zone. And again, blue, yellow is nothing too exciting. You're going to see the red start coming into play down here. Yep, it's starting to pull downwind. This is low velocity, 1 mile per hour. All makes sense. Nothing too dramatic there. But notice the blue down here. This is the one that's interesting. Notice how this blue is now pulling in terms of the dog zone down here. And then you have this big gap of odor availability. Okay. So keep this in mind if you're doing detection work. And then obviously now in the 5 mile per hour, this is where the wind starts pulling back, and you're getting these ground level odor pools down low. Okay, now 10 miles per hour. You're really not seeing anything with regard to the red, the red odor down at ground level. So once the velocity got up, it's pretty much non-existent down on the ground, and it's somewhat limited for the blue and the yellow. So let's take a look at the streamers, and I'm sure some of you kind of figured it out. It's like, oh wow, there's a lot of turbulence, and that angle seemed to make a big impact on it. And the biggest thing is I also have a channelizing effect between these two buildings now, and that kind of amplifies this eddy on the backside. And you can just see that as the wind increases, this eddy effect, this turbulence gets more and more increased, gets stronger, and you start seeing this flow velocity. So this green, that's faster velocity than these cyan colors, which is your main flow of the model. And then same thing here. This is now our 10 mile per hour and very strong turbulence, high velocities. And that's why the red was basically non-existent once you got, at least at ground level, it was non-existent in this velocity range. So you can see though that those buildings can have a dramatic impact. And again, it was pulling the odor back into this. It was creating, a low pressure area. And we've shown that in prior videos. And it was pulling that odor into it and just circulating it and diffusing it because of all the turbulence. So the odor concentration would reduce. So let's summarize things. Sharp angles and varying heights of buildings, they definitely have a significant influence on air velocity and movement. in turn, that impacts odor. And then flows through constricted pathways. Um, thus, that's going to increase velocity. Okay, so if I have this, I have a passageway here. It's constrained. If I have a wind, it's going to increase the velocity trying to go between these two buildings, right? And that increased velocity will decrease odor concentration. Okay, and that's just again through the shear dispersion and the turbulence diffusion. And then we need to be aware of the wind, but we can't rely on it, given that it can change dramatically in the direction and velocity over a very short distance. So really, always be focused on your dog, but while being mindful of your surroundings and the wind. But you can't rely on it like you can like in an open terrain type setting, or something like that's a little bit easier to say, yes, the wind is moving this direction, the source must be in this direction. In this case, that does not apply. And then remember that the potential for odor source can be up high, and the odor pooling down low and dramatically further downwind than you may realize. And just it depends on the wind speed and the terrain and those kind of things. So it's complicated. I wish there was a easy fix. It's like, oh, this rule always applies. No, the purpose of this video is to show that in urban terrain, the wind is not your friend. Okay, it makes your life difficult, and you really have to be on your game. But in the end, you got to focus on your dog and just be mindful of your surroundings and what's going on. So upcoming lessons, I'm kind of getting towards the end of my original list of models that I was going to do, or at least videos. Really, I have a bunch more models, but I'm probably going to do or limit them to in-person training or something like that. Probably won't do them as videos here. Maybe I'll do them as a webinar, that kind of thing. But right now, the ones I am working on is buried hides. I do have some models. I figured out some of the equations, got things kind of heading down that direction. And then one I do want to work on is a true mountainous terrain, but with different vegetation zones. And kind of going back to the search and rescue routes, kind of going back to my hunting routes, and just kind of understanding, in different terrains with different vegetation types throughout that terrain, how does that influence the air movement and the odor movement? That's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And I'm always open to doing in-person training and private webinars. But for right now, like I said, we're starting to wrap up this video series. So, anyways, I appreciate your time. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.